A parched request. The rhythmic hum of the aircraft's engines was almost soothing to Marcus Jefferson, yet the discomfort swirling in his chest made it impossible for him to relax. The gentle vibrations beneath him were a constant reminder of how high above the ground he was, but the excitement of flying alone for the first time was far overshadowed by the suffocating air and the knot in his stomach. Marcus was no stranger to travel, but this was different. His mother, Diana Jefferson, had always flown him first class whenever they went on trips together, but this was his first solo journey. He felt grown up, sitting in a plush, oversized seat with the soft leather cushioning cradling his body. Everything was spotless, from the gleaming windows to the fine linen napkins folded delicately over the tray table. He should have been enjoying it. But Marcus wasn't enjoying it. The cabin air felt thick and dry, like it was being recycled endlessly, suffocating him little by little. His throat burned with each breath, and despite the luxurious surroundings, he felt uncomfortably small. He had tried to distract himself by watching the movies on the screen in front of him, but after the fourth one, he found it hard to concentrate. Every few minutes, his mind would drift back to the dryness in his mouth, to the gnawing discomfort that refused to go away. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, "Speak clearly. Speak with confidence. You have as much right to be heard as anyone else." Marcus tried to steady his nerves. He had been raised in an environment where confidence wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. His mother had always made sure to tell him that he had the power to speak up for himself. "You're just as important as anyone else in that room or on that plane," she often said. "Never let anyone treat you like you don't matter." But now, as he sat in the first-class section of this beautiful, modern jet, it felt as though he didn't matter at all. He pressed the call button for the fourth time, the little blue light blinking above his head. He waited, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. When the attendant didn't immediately appear, a sinking feeling settled in his stomach. He glanced around the cabin, watching as the other passengers chatted easily, relaxed in their seats, the stewardesses attending to their every need without hesitation. He felt as though he were invisible, trapped in this bubble of luxury that wasn't meant for him. Despite his mother's wealth and success, he still sometimes felt out of place in these settings. And today, that feeling was more intense than ever. Minutes passed. Maybe even longer. But it felt like an eternity. The wait was unbearable, but he didn't dare press the call button again. What if they came, and he still wasn't treated with the respect he deserved? What if his request was dismissed again, as it had been before in other situations? He had learned early on in life that it didn't take much for people to overlook him, especially when they could tell he was younger, or when they didn't take the time to look closely at who he was. He could already tell that this flight attendant wasn't going to treat him the same way she had treated the older, white passengers on board. Marcus had noticed how quickly she had served them earlier, a pleasant smile on her face, the exchange smooth and effortless. But with him? There had been no acknowledgement, no words of comfort, no quick service. Just an empty, vacant smile and a dismissal wrapped in politeness. He stared out the window, watching as the clouds stretched below them, their fluffy shapes drifting by in an endless sea of white. The world seemed so far away. His throat grew tighter, the ache in his chest intensifying. He couldn't believe that something as simple as a glass of water was becoming such a struggle. He had flown with his mother before, and there had never been this much hassle over something so small. Marcus tried to swallow, but it only made the dryness worse. The sound of the engines, the drone of voices, and the constant hum of the air vents filled his senses, yet nothing could drown out the discomfort in his throat. He didn't like to ask for help. He never had. His mother had always instilled in him a sense of independence, a quiet self-assurance that came from knowing when to speak up and when to stay silent. But today, he found himself questioning everything he had been taught. Why had she ignored him so thoroughly? Was it because he was a child? Because he was black? Or maybe because he was sitting there alone, surrounded by people who didn't look like him? He wasn't sure, but it hurt. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a figure appeared in the aisle. It was the flight attendant, Stephanie Winters, walking briskly down the row with a look of practiced disinterest. She was tall, slim, and poised, her uniform perfectly pressed and her blonde hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. She looked more like she belonged in a magazine ad for an exclusive perfume than in the middle of an airplane. Her approach was the same as it had been every other time, efficient, mechanical, and cold. Marcus took a deep breath and gathered his courage. He wasn't going to let his nerves win. His mother had always told him that his voice had power, that it carried weight, and that it mattered. If he couldn't speak up for himself now, when would he ever? "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. He watched as Stephanie approached, the familiar smile plastered on her face. She didn't make eye contact right away but glanced down at the empty seat beside him. "Yes?" she asked, her tone clipped, as if her patience were already running thin. Marcus cleared his throat. "May I please have some water?" His voice was soft, but he made sure it was clear. His throat felt tight, the words coming out in an almost strangled gasp. Stephanie paused for a moment, her gaze flicking between Marcus and the empty seat beside him. The polite smile she had been wearing tightened into something more robotic. She nodded once, barely acknowledging him. "I'll be with you shortly," she said, before turning her attention to a man 3 rows ahead who had raised his hand. Marcus blinked in surprise. Had she heard him? It didn't feel like it. And yet, she was already walking away, her attention now completely focused on the older man. He saw her deliver a drink to him, smiling and engaging in conversation with ease. She didn't even spare him a second glance. His heart sank. Was it because he was a kid? Or was it something else? He thought back to his earlier observation of how she treated the other passengers, always polite, always quick with service. But him? He was invisible. Marcus bit his lip, his hands trembling as he slowly leaned back in his seat. He pressed the call button once more, hoping beyond hope that someone would come, that someone would help him. His lips felt cracked and dry, his tongue thick in his mouth as he struggled to hold back the tears that threatened to form. As the light on the call button blinked brightly above his head, Marcus felt utterly powerless. He didn't want to cry, didn't want to seem weak, but it felt like the world was closing in on him. The frustration, the humiliation, the suffocating air, it was all too much. What Marcus didn't know, though, was that at that very moment, his mother, Diana Jefferson, was finalizing a deal that would change everything. At that very moment, while he was waiting for water, Diana was about to become the owner of Meridian Airlines. And the way Marcus was being treated? It wouldn't last long. A deal unfolds. Diana Jefferson stood at the large glass windows of her penthouse office, her fingers lightly tracing the contours of the cool surface. The city below shimmered in the twilight, the sprawling lights of Manhattan reflecting her immense power and the sense of quiet determination that had defined her for years. From here, she could see everything, every building, every street, every opportunity. Her empire had been built on vision, grit, and an unyielding drive to succeed, but today was different. Today was personal. Diana's gaze was sharp as she focused on the document spread across her glass desk. Michael Chen, her longtime chief financial officer, stood beside her, waiting for her to finish reviewing the final contracts for the acquisition of Meridian Airlines. He had been with her for years, a trusted partner in every sense of the word, but today even he could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another business deal, it was the culmination of years of frustration, disappointment, and, ultimately, a desire for justice. As Diana flipped through the pages, her mind was already racing ahead, envisioning what the next steps would look like. She was no stranger to hard work or the complexities of corporate acquisitions, but this particular one was different. Meridian Airlines had long been a thorn in her side, its corporate culture one steeped in old-fashioned arrogance, exclusivity, and, most damningly, racial prejudice. It wasn't just that they'd once treated her as if she didn't belong, it was the way they had treated Marcus. 6 years ago, during a flight from New York to Chicago, Diana and her 10-year-old son Marcus had boarded a Meridian flight for what should have been an uneventful trip. Instead, what should have been a routine journey turned into an all-too-familiar reminder of the prejudices that ran deep in certain corners of society. Marcus had been accused of misbehaving, simply because he had asked a flight attendant for a glass of water, a request that was met not with kindness, but with disdain. The flight attendant had been dismissive, ignoring Marcus when he pressed the call button multiple times, his voice barely audible over the noise of the engines. When Marcus tried again, the attendant had finally approached, her smile cold and impersonal, and when he asked for water, her response was one of annoyance rather than service. It wasn't just the lack of attention that bothered Diana, it was the underlying tone of contempt. The attendant's dismissal was followed by an accusation. Marcus was being disruptive, she said. He was acting out of line. But Diana knew the truth. She had watched her son, the same boy who had shown such poise and confidence despite the tension in the air, remain polite and composed. He had done nothing wrong. And yet, they were kicked off the plane. The humiliation of being removed from the flight in front of dozens of passengers, the whispers that followed them as they made their way off the plane, still haunted her to this day. It wasn't just the flight attendant's actions that hurt, it was the airline's refusal to acknowledge what had happened. Diana had filed complaint after complaint, only to receive generic responses and vague apologies. Meridian Airlines had failed to take accountability for their actions. They had refused to acknowledge the systemic issues within their company that had led to that moment. They had ignored her, and they had ignored Marcus. But Diana didn't forget. She never forgot. And now, after years of planning, strategizing, and patiently waiting for the right moment, Diana was about to take control of Meridian Airlines in the most public, undeniable way possible. Everything's set, Michael said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. We've acquired a controlling stake. The deal goes through tomorrow morning, and you'll officially be the majority shareholder. Diana set the pen down with deliberate slowness, her fingers still lingering on the edges of the contract. Her mind wandered to Marcus again, her bright, intelligent, kind-hearted son. She could still remember his expression that day on the plane, his confusion as the attendant walked away, leaving him thirsty and helpless in his seat. He had looked to her for reassurance, but Diana had felt powerless in that moment, unable to shield him from the reality that others saw him as less than, as someone to be ignored, even mistreated. She had told herself it was just one instance. That it wouldn't define Marcus. That he was strong enough to rise above it. But deep down, Diana knew that it was more than just one flight. It was the accumulation of all the ways Marcus had been overlooked in his life, all the ways he had been judged before even being given a chance to prove himself. It was a reminder of the pervasive culture of bias that seeped into every part of society, even in the most unexpected places. She took a deep breath and turned to Michael, her face now firm, resolute. I want every department head at Meridian on a conference call first thing tomorrow morning. I'll be handling this acquisition directly. Michael nodded. Of course. We've already begun drafting the announcement for the press. Diana paused, her mind calculating. I don't want the public to see this as just another corporate move. I want it to be clear, this is about accountability. This is about changing the way things are done. And the first thing we're going to do is make sure that the employees who allowed this kind of behavior, who let that flight attendant get away with treating my son like that, are held accountable. She stood up from her desk, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows once again, her eyes scanning the skyline. It's not just about acquiring an airline, Michael. It's about creating an example. It's about reshaping the industry. For every child who has ever been ignored, dismissed, or mistreated. For every mother who has had to watch her child suffer in silence because of someone else's bias. Michael watched her carefully, his admiration for her strength evident. Understood, Diana. I'll make sure the message is clear. Diana turned back toward him, her dark eyes alight with purpose. We will build an airline where every passenger is treated with respect, regardless of their race, their background, or their status. We will make sure no child, no mother, no father ever has to feel invisible again." As she spoke, Diana's thoughts drifted to Marcus once more. She had to protect him from a world that wasn't always kind, from a system that often judged him before it even knew him. But it wasn't enough to protect him, she had to change the system. She had to make sure that the injustice he'd faced that day wasn't just a fleeting incident but the beginning of a new path, a path of accountability and change. "This is for you, Marcus," she thought, her voice steady in her mind. "This is for every child who deserves a chance to be seen, heard, and valued for who they are." Meanwhile, far above the ground, on that very Meridian Airlines flight, Marcus had no idea that his mother was about to change the course of the airline forever. He still sat alone in his seat, the call button flashing above him. He still hadn't received his water. And Stephanie Winters, the flight attendant who had so carelessly dismissed his request, was blissfully unaware that her actions were about to have repercussions far beyond her immediate service. As the plane continued its course toward Chicago, a new chapter was unfolding, one that would change the airline industry, and more importantly, the lives of people like Marcus Jefferson, forever. The ripple effect. The hum of the airplane's engines and the faint clinking of silverware from the first-class cabin was all Marcus could hear. He sat back in his seat, his lips dry, his throat still burning from the air-conditioned chill that had replaced any warmth of comfort. He had hoped that the flight would be an exciting adventure, his first time flying solo in first class, but the experience had quickly soured. His request for a glass of water had been ignored repeatedly, not once but 4 times, as if his need for something as basic as hydration wasn't important enough to warrant attention. He glanced around the cabin. There were other passengers, some with smiles on their faces, others buried in their books or papers. A couple of businessmen in the row ahead exchanged quiet words, their laughter punctuated by the occasional sip of scotch. The flight attendant, Stephanie Winters, had continued her rounds, serving drinks, delivering snacks, and chatting politely with the other passengers. But every time her gaze flicked over him, it felt like she saw through him, as if he didn't even belong in that seat, let alone in her orbit. With every passing moment, Marcus's discomfort grew. His mother had always told him to stand tall, to speak clearly, and to never let anyone make him feel invisible. Yet here, in this moment, surrounded by all these people, he felt like the air itself had conspired to render him unnoticed. After another 10 minutes of waiting and pressing the call button fruitlessly, Marcus finally made the decision to stand up. He had never been one to let things slide, even at his young age. He had grown up with a mother who had instilled in him a fierce sense of self-worth, who had taught him that he was just as deserving as anyone else of respect. It wasn't in his nature to shrink back. So, with the stubbornness he had inherited from Diana, he made his way down the narrow aisle, toward the galley where the attendants worked. As he walked, his mind wandered briefly to his mother. She had warned him about this kind of treatment when he was younger, people who would look at him and decide that he didn't matter. She had always told him that no matter what others saw, he was worthy. She had even taught him how to speak up for himself, how to ask for what he needed, how to be persistent, and how to expect kindness in return. But Marcus never expected it to be this hard. He never expected to feel so small, so dismissed, simply for being a black child asking for something as simple as water. Stephanie, who was deep in conversation with a middle-aged man about the best red wines to pair with meals, barely noticed him standing there at first. Her eyes flicked past him, almost as though he were a ghost. But Marcus wasn't one to give up. "Excuse me," he said, his voice polite but firm. "Could I please get some water?" She paused mid-sentence, her smile faltering. Then, she glanced up at him with a slight furrow in her brow. "I'll be with you in a moment," she said curtly, her tone clipped, before turning back to the man she was speaking with. Marcus stood there, his legs aching, his throat burning, as the minutes ticked by. The other flight attendants continued with their duties, laughing and chatting, oblivious to his presence. It felt like time stretched out in front of him, endless and frustrating. The world seemed to be moving in fast forward, while he remained frozen in place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Stephanie turned to him. Her smile was tight, her eyes slightly narrowed. "You should be seated. I'll bring you your water," she said with a forced politeness that didn't reach her eyes. She didn't wait for him to respond before she turned on her heel and walked away, already lost in her next task. Marcus returned to his seat, feeling the sting of humiliation creeping under his skin. He was no longer sure if he wanted the water. What he wanted was recognition. What he wanted was respect. But what he didn't know was that the moment he had just endured was about to ignite a ripple effect that would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire airline industry. High above in the executive suite of Meridian Airlines headquarters, Diana Jefferson was preparing for the next phase of her plan. As the evening light from the setting sun bathed her office in a warm glow, she reflected on how far she had come. It had been nearly 6 years since the incident with Marcus on that Meridian flight, and everything had led to this moment. The final paperwork for the acquisition of the airline was about to be signed. But even though the deal was a triumph, it was still tinged with the bitterness of what had happened. Diana had waited patiently, building her business, securing her financial empire, all while keeping her eyes on the prize, change. She wasn't simply buying Meridian Airlines, she was taking back control. She was going to hold the airline accountable for every misstep, for every failure to treat customers with dignity, and especially for the way they had treated her son. She sat at her desk, staring at the paperwork in front of her, when Michelson entered the room again, holding his phone in one hand. "Everything's ready," he said, glancing at the documents before handing her a cup of tea. He hesitated, then added, "There's something else you need to see. It's about Marcus." Diana's brow furrowed as she took the phone. On the screen was a video, a shaky, unprofessional recording, but it was enough to capture the moment that her son had been ignored repeatedly. The footage, while grainy, clearly showed Marcus asking the flight attendant for water, his polite request met with disdain and avoidance. It wasn't the first time Diana had been made aware of the incident, but seeing it again, this time from a stranger's perspective, made her blood boil. She set the phone down, taking a long breath, her face hardening. "This is unacceptable. We can't let this go on any longer." Michael nodded. "I thought you'd want to see this before we proceed." Diana's mind raced, already strategizing how to handle this in a way that would send a clear message, not just to the airline, but to the public. This wasn't just about a personal vendetta. This was about systemic change, about holding people accountable for their actions. "Send this to the media," she said, her voice cold and controlled. "We release it to the press the moment the acquisition is finalized." Michael looked at her, surprised by the decision. "Are you sure? It could cause a lot of backlash. The board might." "I'm sure," Diana cut him off, her tone unwavering. "The public needs to know what kind of company Meridian Airlines has been. They need to understand why we're making changes, and why they're necessary. This is just the beginning." As she spoke, her thoughts turned again to Marcus, still on that plane. He had no idea that his mother was about to unleash a storm on the airline that would force them to reckon with their behavior. Diana didn't care about the backlash, she cared about making sure this never happened to anyone again. "Let's make sure the announcement is clear," she continued, her voice now firm with resolve. "We will make sure that every person at Meridian who has contributed to this kind of culture understands the consequences of their actions. This isn't just a business acquisition, it's a cultural overhaul." Meanwhile, Marcus was still waiting. The water never came. As the plane began its descent toward Chicago, he felt a pang of frustration that wasn't entirely due to thirst. It was the frustration of knowing he had been made to feel small, overlooked, and unimportant simply because of the color of his skin. It was the frustration of realizing that, despite his mother's teachings, the world around him could still be cruel, dismissive, and unfair. But he would never let that define him. Not today. Not ever. As the plane touched down, the final leg of his journey was just beginning, and though the moment felt heavy, it was only a precursor to something bigger, something far beyond the confines of that airplane. As for Stephanie Winters, she had no idea that the consequences of her behavior were already set in motion, and soon, the entire world would be watching. The storm unleashed. The moment the airplane touched down in Chicago, Marcus was both relieved and anxious. His first solo flight had been full of more anxiety than excitement, and it was hard to shake the feeling that something more significant was at play here. As he stood up from his seat, his legs a little unsteady from sitting too long, his heart raced, not just from the plane's descent but from the weight of everything that had transpired. He hadn't realized it yet, but the events that unfolded on that flight, as small and seemingly insignificant as they seemed, were just the beginning of something much larger. Diana Jefferson, his mother, had been carefully orchestrating a plan to take control of Meridian Airlines. But she wasn't just after an acquisition for the sake of profit. This was personal. What had happened to Marcus all those years ago, the humiliation and the pain, had sparked a fire in her that had yet to extinguish. And now, after everything, the final steps of her plan were about to change not only the airline but the very culture that had allowed such incidents to occur. As Marcus stepped off the plane, he didn't see the whirlwind approaching him. He was tired, dehydrated, and still bothered by how he had been treated. But he would learn soon enough, as he was about to walk straight into a storm that would leave an impact far beyond his imagination. Back at Meridian Airlines headquarters in New York, Diana was finalizing the details of the press release. She had been deliberate, calm, and methodical in her strategy. She knew the media would be quick to jump on the story of an airline ignoring a child, but she wanted them to see the bigger picture, the toxic culture that allowed people like Marcus to be treated like they were invisible, as if their requests for basic human decency were too much to ask. The moment the press release hit, the storm would begin. She had no intention of letting Meridian escape scrutiny. Diana had made sure to keep everything anonymous at first, letting the press do their work before they connected the dots. As she sipped her tea, she heard the ding of her phone, indicating that the final paperwork for the acquisition had been completed. The deal was done. Meridian Airlines now belonged to her. But it wasn't just a business transaction. It was the beginning of a movement, one that would disrupt the comfort of those who had perpetuated these injustices for so long. Diana's phone buzzed again, and she glanced down at the notification. It was a message from Michael Chen. "We've just sent the footage to the media. It's already gone viral." Her eyes narrowed as she quickly opened the message and clicked on the link. The footage was everywhere. The video of Marcus, small and yet filled with a quiet strength, pressing the call button, then standing up to ask for water, his request ignored, had captured the attention of millions. People were outraged, both by the blatant dismissal of a child's simple request and the arrogance of the flight attendant who had refused to offer any form of service. The reactions flooded in from all corners of the internet. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #MeridianFail. News outlets picked up the story, some portraying it as a moment of reckoning for the airline, others focusing on the broader issue of systemic racism in customer service industries. Diana sat back in her chair, feeling a sense of grim satisfaction. The storm had begun, and there was no turning back. As the hours passed, the impact of the video only grew. Diana watched from her office as the controversy surrounding Meridian Airlines escalated. It wasn't just about a flight attendant ignoring a black child anymore. It was about accountability. It was about people in positions of power being forced to reckon with their behavior, their bias, and their failure to treat everyone with respect. Meanwhile, Marcus, who had arrived in Chicago and was being picked up by his mother's assistant, didn't fully understand the magnitude of what was happening. He was more concerned about getting something to drink and relaxing after the long, uncomfortable flight. When he saw the headlines on his phone, though, his confusion deepened. "What's all this about?" he asked, holding up the phone. Diana's assistant, Kelly, who had picked him up from the airport, glanced at the screen and tried to play it cool. "It looks like your flight's gone a little viral. You're all over the news, kid." Marcus's eyebrows furrowed. "What do you mean? All I asked for was some water." Kelly smiled softly, trying not to overwhelm him with the weight of the situation. "You'll understand soon enough. Your mom's going to explain everything to you. It's going to be okay." As they drove through the streets of Chicago, Marcus continued to scroll through the news, his eyes wide with disbelief. He still couldn't fully comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. To him, it was just another flight. But to the world, it was so much more, a moment of truth, a turning point that forced people to confront their actions. When they arrived at Diana's penthouse, Marcus was finally able to sit down and relax. Diana, as always, was calm and composed. She had seen the video herself and knew it would stir up emotions, but she was focused on something bigger. She wasn't just angry at Meridian Airlines. She was angry at the system that allowed people like Stephanie Winters to exist in positions of power and dismiss people based on their race. She was angry that the world was still so blind to the everyday injustices faced by people like her son, people like her, people like so many others. Diana pulled Marcus aside as soon as he arrived. "I know you don't fully understand what's happening, sweetheart, but this is just the beginning." Marcus looked at her, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "All I did was ask for water." Diana smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "I know. But it's not about the water. It's about how you were treated. It's about how people like Stephanie think they can treat you that way simply because of the color of your skin. It's about showing the world that we won't tolerate this anymore." Marcus nodded slowly, his young mind trying to piece everything together. He had always known that his mom was powerful, but now, for the first time, he was beginning to understand the depths of her strength and determination. The following days were a blur of media interviews, public statements, and press conferences. Diana was a master at navigating the storm. She had already anticipated the backlash that Meridian Airlines would attempt to generate, but she was ready. The public, fueled by the outrage over the video, was on her side. The airline's executives, scrambling to salvage their reputation, were forced to issue public apologies, though they were often half-hearted and transparent in their insincerity. But the damage had been done. The world was watching. And Marcus, the young boy who had simply asked for a glass of water, had become the face of a movement, one that sought to hold corporate America accountable, one that sought to challenge the deeply ingrained biases that pervaded industries everywhere. The ripple effect of that single moment continued to spread, reaching far beyond Marcus and his mother. It sparked conversations in boardrooms, living rooms, and classrooms. It forced people to confront the uncomfortable truth about racial inequality in everyday life. And as for Diana Jefferson? She had just begun to reshape the world, using her power not just for business, but for change. With Meridian Airlines now under her control, she was setting the stage for a new era of customer service, one where everyone, regardless of their race, background, or identity, would be treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. The storm had only just begun, and Diana was ready to face it head-on.